Welcome to Finding Your Inner Mr. Rogers. I'm Todd Faber, and I believe that in a world of noise and speed, the most radical thing we can be is kind. We often think of leadership as being in charge, but Fred Rogers taught us that true leadership is about being in service to the dignity of others. Our guest today is Angelo Santinelli, an experienced entrepreneur, venture capitalist, executive coach, and academic who has dedicated his career to cultivating potential and navigating the human complexities of business. As the founder of Dakin Management, he provides high impact strategic advisory and leadership development to executives and high growth organizations. A long-standing member of the faculty at Babson College, Angelo has spent years shaping the minds of global leaders, innovators, specializing in entrepreneurship, financing new ventures, and strategic planning. Whether guiding a student in the classroom, advising a founder in the boardroom, or steering a venture through pivotal transitions, Angelo bridges the gap between sophisticated business execution and deeply empathetic mentorship. His leadership style reflects the very essence of Fred Rogers. He believes that a leader's highest calling isn't just to manage metrics, but to truly see, understand, and elevate the individual human beings right in front of them. Welcome to the neighborhood, Angelo.
Thanks, Todd. I'm still having a hard time, as I'm sure anybody who knows me well, with the comparison to Fred Rogers. But we're
Well, I
gonna
think I
we're
think
gonna
the
go with
fact.
it and let the audience decide.
Well, listen, I will tell you something. The fact that you are humble enough to acknowledge that is the very reason that you belong here in this neighborhood. So, we all bring different sort of skill sets to the table, and Fred brought all of them, and each one of
Hmm.
us kind of brings a little piece of that. And when we can show the value in that little small segment to the rest of the world, it kind of helps guide them to be better leaders. And, that's why you're here. So I'm thrilled that you're here in the neighborhood. And, funny enough, our neighborhoods used to be pretty close to each other in
We
real
used to
life.
be pretty
So,
close, yeah.
so that, that
Meetings at
that's
the coffee
huge.
shop in Maynard, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So I'm thrilled you're here. You are welcomed here and you belong here. So,
Thank you. Appreciate
um,
that.
well, listen, with that, as you and I talked a little bit about this, part of what I'm doing is I'm building this neighborhood of a variety of different leaders from all walks of life. And I've assigned like little archetypes to everybody. And given your incredible long-standing history in the mentorship, I sort of designated you as our mindful mentor. And we often think about in this fast-paced, transactional world of entrepreneurship and business, mentorship can easily get reduced to advice on scaling or funding. But I really see true mentorship as being deeply rational, or excuse me, deeply rational, deeply relational. Um, so how do you
Should
approach
be rational
building?
too.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe that's where the Freudian slip comes in a little bit.
Yeah, probably.
Um, but in thinking about that, in terms of how you view it, how do you approach building that safe, sort of trusting neighborhood for a young leader so they feel secure enough to talk about where they failed, where they've had success, what their anxieties are, not just true wins, but how do I grow? How do I learn from my mistakes and being comfortable enough to have those conversations?
Yeah. I think that it's not something. Well, there's different types of power that you can have, right? And a lot of people tend to exploit the easiest one, which is power of position, right? I'm in charge. I gave you the, if you're on the board, you're your venture capitalist. I gave you the money, therefore you work for me, right? There are even some of the texts and individuals who lecture will say, once you take money, you're working for someone, and you're working for the board. And you could try to you can use that power position if you really want to get the most out of an individual or a team. I always found that it was more fun trying to assemble a team together, and there was a lot of work in that, in seeing if people could mesh. But in order to get the permission to do that without dictating, here's your new VP of marketing or something, is you got to build trust, and trust takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. People have to know that you care. So nobody cares what you know until they know that you care. They have to believe that you're competent. So you better be able to demonstrate competence in what you're doing as a board member, as a former operating executive. They want consistency. They don't like being whipsawed. That's probably the number one complaint you'll hear from a lot of individuals, whether you're working in a big company or a small company, is that, there's a new strategy every day. I was told this last week and then I was told this week. So consistency matters. And then at the, core of all that is character. Are you somebody that has good character, or are you telling people to behave one way while you're behaving an entirely different way? I think the last part about that is learning how to accept vulnerability. Being able to say, I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to find it out. Why don't we try to find it out together? And that's something that, used the right way, can build a lot of trust. You could use it the wrong way too. We could talk more about that later if you want.
Well, it's interesting. That theme has run through a lot of these podcasts so far.
Hmm.
It's that when leaders are comfortable showing vulnerability, the people that work with them are as well. And that's where you get the most innovation and success as leaders and as companies or organizations, nonprofits, whatever it happens to be, when people can say, hey, I don't know the answer to this. I'm not comfortable answering this. And then they're encouraged to find the answer, to your point, whether on their own or together. And that's a really key component to great leadership, as far as I'm concerned, is to say, hey, I screwed up, or I don't know the answer to this. How do we figure this out? How do we solve this problem? And when people feel comfortable doing that, they're more apt to, again, open themselves up to it, as opposed to withdrawing. Because, at the end of the day, when you hire people or when you invest in people, but you create stress so much so that they don't want to or feel comfortable enough to
Hmm.
acknowledge where they're failing, then why'd you bring them on in the first place? Right?
Well,
And that's
not only that, but all you're going to get are lies, right? I mean, it's fight or flight, right? Most of the time, people are not going to tell you how they're really feeling, or that they don't know something, because the fear is that either you, as the manager or leader, whatever, is going to look down on them and lose faith in them, or other people in the room are. And there are cultures that are built that way, and it's dog eat dog. It's every individual for themselves. Some people like that. I don't particularly enjoy it, or find that it's very effective. Again, you'd rather be getting the real information and working on a solution together. But I do think, look, you have to be careful also as a leader. I mean, vulnerability has its limitations too, right? It's one thing to admit on some details around things, I'm not sure about that, or why don't you, I'm open. Why don't you educate me on that? But if you are someone who, constantly leans in that direction, then they start to question your competence,
of course.
right?
They're
Or if you completely have, you'll lose it in challenging situations. I mean, look, people, a lot of people, individuals want to be led, right? It's just like kids want to be parented. They really do. But if in the most difficult moments you're nowhere to be found, you've gone into the bunker, or you're panicking on the battlefield, I mean, that doesn't do any good either. That's a kind of vulnerability. That's a big negative.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is that sort of threshold or tipping point where
Hmm.
they become incompetent. And so, but again, allowing them, or even allowing yourself as a leader to say, hey, okay, here's how we change this, here's how we do this, we create a culture, right? And, one of the core components of this podcast is this notion of a shared humanity,
Hmm.
and that great leadership can create that both inside and outside the office. So when you're actually coaching tomorrow's executives, how do you challenge them to measure their success, not just in numbers, but in the culture they create and how they treat people? Um, because that can be just as important in some instances as the bottom.
Yeah. I think the hard part about that, um, is that you could generally, I always like, I was on boards whether they were business boards or had the pleasure of being on a board of trustees for one period of time at a school. I'd always show up early and I'd walk around, I'd chat with people, I'd just observe to see what was going on. If I could, I'd stay later. I'd have dinner with kids at the school or teachers, or at a company I had to travel to, have dinner with the CEO, but also sometimes some of the employees along. And you just want to see how everybody behaves. And you could tell a lot by being observant to see. But where it really shows up is when you have challenging times, right? You'll know if someone is a good leader if they're able to, well, first of all, if they have put the right kind of people around them, right? Always liked the saying, and I got in trouble for this in academia. There were some people who thought it was the height of arrogance. But I always said A players like to play with A players, and B players like to hire C players so they can feel good about themselves.
They have the same sort of logic with law school, by the way, in terms of
Yeah,
A, B, and C students. So I get it.
right, right. So you want, can somebody recruit the A's? I mean, when you can recruit someone who, like in some instances, you've got an individual who might be getting a look at some potential CEO jobs. Now, they may not be great CEO jobs, but they really want that, mark of the CEO. And you're able to convince that person to come on with you for one more ride, on another adventure, but not being the CEO, maybe being a VP or an SVP or just playing another role. I mean, there's an art to that, and it's also, that means that they respect you. They believe in your leadership capabilities. You're gonna take them on an adventure, and you're going to navigate the ship the right way, right? And then it also shows up when things aren't going well, and you have to ask people to dig deep. Right? I mean, Dorian, you and I were talking about this, our 250th, and I like history. I know you do too. And I was reading about George Washington at Valley Forge, and the fact that, here he basically was getting his butt kicked. I mean, he was in full retreat for many months, and then finally took, the semblance of what left and reached, the outskirts of Philadelphia. And, it was cold. They were running out of food. They were running out of munitions, and it looked like, the gig was up. But he also, many of the individuals that were there were about to, their time with the Army was going to expire. And he gathered them all together and basically, shared a vision and gave them a reason to stick around. Most of them did. Some said, look, just can't do it. Got to go home to the farm, and I've been doing this for a while, but most of them did. And then he stepped it up by, orchestrating the crossing of the Delaware, attacking the Hessians outside of Trenton, and winning. And that buoyed the troops, and it also, sent a message to the opposition, the UK, that, hey, we're in this for the long haul. At least they believe that, and that's why they eventually checked out of it, right? So when a leader, look, when you're in an environment where there's lots of startups, there's lots of money being put out, and your company's having a little bit of an issue, maybe it's finding product market fit, or you're not hitting the sales numbers you want to hit. And to be able to ask people to, give you just a little bit more, if you don't have if you haven't demonstrated character and caring and consistency and competence, they're gonna run for the hills. There's a lot of money out there, and they'll go find it. But you build loyalty and you build respect, and it starts also by making value-based decisions always.
No, I think that's great advice, and like I said to you offline, the Washington analogy is absolutely fantastic, and it sort of leads me to think about sort of my next thought. And again, we talk a little bit about the foundation of the podcast, and I know I chatted with you a little bit about my 95% rule that I implemented when my girls were little, but basically the idea is that the vast majority of people we meet, they're navigating unseen burdens, and our job as leaders is to acknowledge that, try to leave the neighborhood, so to speak, better than we found it, Um, how was it for you with all the things that you've been doing over the years? Were you able to sort of keep that human perspective and shaping how you kind of navigate tough corporate negotiations and these founder investor relationships? Because
Yeah,
that is a component of it, right? And finding shared humanity, finding common ground, so you could work together to get these jobs done.
yeah,
And
yeah. Well, I think part of the reason I do what I'm doing today, you and I talked offline and shared this, why the executive coaching? One reason is just to remain relevant, to keep working, right? You and I cut from the same cloth. We come from environments where, they took our parents out with their boots on. And I like to do that, like to stay relevant. The other reason is, um, that I wish I could sit here and say, boy, I always made the best decisions and I always made the value based decisions. And I think it's because we all have flaws and I've made those mistakes. I'm not ashamed to share those mistakes with my clients, before with my students, and just say, hey, this kind of happened to me, or this is how I behaved in this situation. Wasn't very happy or proud about it. But it's not the end of the world. You can catch yourself and you can move on from it. I think the other thing is you just, as you said, you never know what's going on in somebody else's house.
right.
You just don't know. And, there's different ways to handle that, right? One is that you can sort of sit there and make a bunch of assumptions about what's happening, which is never useful, or you can sit down and have a conversation with someone and just say what's going on. Or if you're in a challenging negotiation, understand what they need. The we've really lost the concept of the win-win.
Yeah.
And the win-win doesn't mean, we're going to split the difference, right? There's that book that came out, Never Split the Difference kind of thing. I, you know, yeah, probably, but I think you have to know what it is you really want in a negotiation. And you also have to know what it is they really want. And you have to also understand, what am I willing to trade? What are some of the things I'm willing to give up on or back off on in order to get the deal done?
Mhm.
When Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would be, debating about something, right? They go back to one of their offices and they'd sit there and O'Neill would say, I think it was Tip O'Neill who said, okay, there's enough stuff in this bill for both sides to hate. I think we're done. But there was enough in there for both sides to like too. And what he was signaling was, I can go back and sell this. I can go back and sell this, and then they break out the scotch. So I think you have to understand both sides of every argument, and you have to know what you're willing to trade off on, in order to get it done.
It's a balancing act
Yeah,
always. Like everything
yeah.
is.
And
Go ahead.
if you don't know that, or if you have irrational beings in the background, you end up like some of the characters who I was listening to on the news recently, who were trying to negotiate a peace deal and sitting at the table and saying, yeah, okay, we agree to that, we can do that, and then going back and saying, well, this is where we came out, and the individual in charge says, no, we're not going to do that. So either they changed their position, or the people that were trusted with doing a negotiation didn't find out what we were willing to trade off, right? And again, that's the kind of whipsawing that drives anybody crazy.
It's difficult because part of it always comes down to trust too in these
Mm-hmm.
relationships, and trust to me starts with authenticity,
Yeah.
right? And so when you think about like Fred Rogers, he often said that the most courageous thing we can do is actually just be ourselves, be who you
Mm-hmm.
are, approach every situation that same way. However, it becomes difficult, I would think, as you were mentioning, even in negotiations, whether it's political negotiations or high stakes finance negotiations, where leaders oftentimes see that vulnerability as a deficiency. They want to appear bulletproof. And I know as a coach, when you talk to founders and executives, how do you sort of help them navigate that balance between
Yeah.
authenticity, vulnerability, but at the same time trying to maintain their sense of authority in
Yeah.
a negotiation or
The,
in a board?
the challenge with those such, particularly negotiations and the like, is everything's contextual, right? So
Right.
you can't say, well, this is how it should be done. When you take these negotiation classes, I took the Harvard one years ago, and sometimes you're sort of like, it doesn't always go that way. It doesn't always go that smoothly, right? It's just the real calls are nothing like the mock calls. I think what you have to do, and one of the things I do this with pretty much all my clients, is I do a values assessment. And it always starts with, I'll go, what do you want me to do? And I'm like, I want to understand where your values are. I can't help you unless I understand the kind of person you are. And so I explained to them that, values are, think of it like an iceberg, right? Everybody knows there's more going on under the water than on top of the water, right? So back to the point of, you never know what's informing people's behavior, their language, their decisions and the like. And it's values, right? Your values inform all the things that people can observe and experience from you. So, along with consistency, again, if you're able to make value based decisions, know what your values are, and make value based decisions, or if you have to choose to subjugate one of those values, you can actually say, I am knowingly doing this,
Yeah.
right? And acknowledge that this is a shift. I'm not happy to have to do it this way, but for these reasons, this is what we're going to do. So the other challenge with that is everybody goes, well, I know what I value. So I throw a list of a little over 100 values in front of people. Many of them seem similar, and I have them go through a process. I go pick 18 to 25. And then what I do is take them through a conjoint analysis. That's a pairwise analysis. So it's like, okay, if you can only take one with you, would you take A or B, A or C, A or D? And you do that for all of the values. And what it does is it boils them down to a top 10 or 12, which you then can turn into value strings and make some sense of. And you go, all right, well, this is you. This is you. I've never done it without people kind of being a little surprised, where if they'll talk, usually it's the money thing. They're like, yeah, it's about money. It's about being wealthy. And then you find out that juxtaposed to all these other things, it kind of goes down the list. And you go, so when you're in a situation, a negotiation, making a difficult and challenging decision, right? The thing you can always do is go through your processes and then step back and say, does this honor or does it subjugate my values? How do I
Yeah.
really feel about that? And so it's a guide. It's not always like you're not always going to say, I'm doing it, and these are the three things that matter the most. And so sometimes you have to back off. Again, there's trade-offs.
Right.
So sometimes you have to step back. But I think not knowing what it is you value kind of puts you at risk of um, not really understanding what are we negotiating about here. You get in these situations there, so where people are mad and they're feuding, and you go, "What are you guys fighting about?" You go, we forgot. This conversation's gone so many different directions. We forgot what the hell we're mad at.
Right. Well, it is interesting because again, turning this back to that idea of authenticity, when you can help people see that, I think they feel more confident in their ability to lead because they're leading from a place that they trust themselves as well.
Yeah,
That they're not simply just, oh, this is what I think I need, but I've gone through this exercise. I understand who I am,
yeah,
and therefore I can negotiate from a sense of authentic strength, so to speak.
hmm
And when people around them who work with them see that, again, that helps kind of build their trust.
yeah,
Because right now, I mean, we're kind of living in a time where workplace anxiety and burnout are probably at their highest they've been in a long time, in
hmm
spite of the fact that less people are actually going into the office. Um, but it is what it is. It's the reality we're living in. And so with as a mentor, as a coach, you I'm sure see this firsthand
hmm
and how it impacts performance, morale. What do you see the responsibility of a leader today to kind of protect a little bit that emotional climate of their organization? And how do you kind of teach them to bring a sense of calm in these high stress situations that are already externally anxiety ridden?
I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have just sort of abdicated responsibility for it and say it's not my job. And I think that's wrong. But look, again, this is your team, right? You're putting a team on the field. The objective in most capitalist societies is, to get out there and win something, right? On a daily, monthly, quarterly, yearly basis. So to just say, that's not my responsibility, I think is the wrong answer. Now, you don't want to get overly complicated or involved in people's lives. But again, if you've developed that trust, if people know that you care, they're more likely to share what's going on. The other thing is, you don't. At least I think one of the challenges I have talking to a lot of people is that I don't feel like there's a vision where I'm working. I'm like, what do you mean? Tell me about this. They haven't. Nobody's paint. They don't paint a vision of where they're going. Like, this is our long-term vision. This is where we want to be as a company in 10 years. But we have to increment our way there. So here's the 1 year plan. Here's the 3 year plan. Here's where I hope to be in 5 years. And here are the big rocks that we're going to be, working with to get there, right? Here are the 3 to 5 things we'll focus on as a company. That vision translates into purpose. Now, help people understand, what do people want? This generation most of the time wants to know why. Why are you asking me to do that? So paint the vision and explain why you want them to do what you're asking them to do. They want to understand the what. What is it specifically I need to do to succeed? And then sometimes the how. And this is where the work from home thing is challenging, because I think a lot of young people are losing out on learning about the how. How do things get done? It's not all numbers all the time, right? There's a lot of politics, and that's not necessarily a dirty word, right? There's a way to sort of, amass resources that you need, that everybody wants, right? And how do you get those resources working on your project in your favor and getting things done? So the why, the what, and the how. And I think that if more people were just honest with employees and open about the challenges that they're having working in this environment, which is pretty crazy and unstable for a lot of reasons.
Right.
I think you get more out of people, and that's you get more out of people without leaving a lot of carnage, I would say. Right? I've heard this from people, and quite frankly, I find it kind of disgusting. Or like, yeah, well, you know what? There's so many people that want a job with us that we don't care. So if somebody burns out and they leave, it's like, yeah, next up. And those are easy to find those environments. Go in and find out, they have the great policy of, you have unlimited PTO, and then ask how many days they actually took.
Right.
So it's great to say unlimited PTO, and then the rumor mill says, yeah, don't even think you're going to take that.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
I like that process of trying to break down a vision, the why, the what, the how, because what that does is it enables folks that work for you or with you to better understand why they're going to
Mm-hmm.
be wed to the mission of the company, right? And when you can
Right.
get people comfortable with that, A, that serves you well because they don't want to leave, but B, it does reduce the level of anxiety around understanding where we're going. Because that's a big problem in any walk of life, whether it's professional or personal. Understanding or having some sense of where you're going does reduce anxiety that's, all over the place, and
Yeah.
we're all feeling it for different reasons. And so
Yeah.
great leaders really do break it down that way. And I love that idea that you can sort of say to them, hey, break it down, understand where you're going, how, and set it up in the increments and say, this is why we're doing it, this is what we're doing, and this is how we're going to get there. And yeah, to your point, the work from home does make it more difficult because you're right. It's not all about numbers. And, we talk about, when you talk about the politics piece of it not being a dirty word, because it's relationships. right? And
Yeah.
when you can develop relationships, it's a lot easier to develop relationships when you're in person with somebody than even doing it the way we're doing it now, let alone just through text or what is it my daughter uses? Slack, right?
Slack.
They
Yeah. Oh
Slack
God,
people.
Slack.
And
Yeah.
oh yeah, I was slacking them this. And I was like, well, hold on a second. How did you read that Slack? What did you read it to mean? Because we misconstrue emails, we
Yeah.
misconstrue text messages, we
Yeah.
misconstrue Slacks because we can't see what's happening on the other side. And the level of interaction is unilateral
Yeah.
because I'm sending you something and then I'm waiting for a response
Yeah.
versus I'm saying something to you and I'm seeing your face.
Right, right.
So,
There's that aspect of it, and then I used to like I had to use Slack in several situations, and still have an account, and it still gets used sometimes. But I literally described it to someone as a 100-yard dash for people with no sense of direction. I mean, there is so much crap going on in Slack that I almost find they're like, oh, it's better to organize. I'm like, really? This seems to me, insane. Like, if you look at all the pings back and forth on something, you're like, you could have put people in a stand-up meeting for 3 minutes and figured this out.
yes.
Not 30, 3, and just get it done. Years ago, I remember the CEO of the company I was with invited me to meet his mentor and his older gentleman. And the question that came up, he said, what's one of the things that you see that has changed in business, and not for the better? And he said, this email stuff. And we're like, really? Why? And he said, it's too much communication. Now, we dug into that more, during the conversation. And it wasn't that there was too much communication. There was too much useless communication. He saw it as the beginnings of the idea that a flurry of activity means I'm progressing. And he said, activity and results don't always match up. And email allows some people to kind of hide behind the screen and send out a lot of emails and copy everybody. He goes, now everybody's got to read this stuff. And it's sort of, look at me, look at how busy I am. But are they getting anything done? And so I think that's part of the challenge of what we have today is there's just too much technology. And people, the big thing, I wrote about last week in my blog was about, everyone looking to AI for efficiencies. And it's great, wonderful, get efficiencies. But are you sacrificing efficaciousness in the process? So, hey, we're much more efficient at this workflow, but the results suck even more now than they did before. Have you achieved anything? I mean, the only place I know where it's good to, as they say, suck quickly is golf, because you don't want to hold up the course, right? So they're like, look, if you stink, just be fast about it.
Yeah. Own it. Own
Right,
it.
but in business, that's not helping. I mean, we'll start to see more and more reports and research on this coming in the future, in the near future, and some of it's coming out now where people invested a lot of money and retrained a lot of people, and what they're finding is it's just accelerating the amount of slop that other colleagues have to wade through, figure out what's real, what's not, how we're going to treat this, and so on. And AI will be a net positive, I hope, for society. But you gotta wade through a lot of garbage before you get to that point.
Well, I mean, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah,
Just
probably.
in terms of how it gets used, and but you mentioned that you were meeting with somebody who kind of brought his mentor out, who talked a little bit about why, from his mind, what's changed in the use of email. But thinking back on your career,
Mm,
uh, Fred Rogers believed that there are people in our lives who shape us into our caretakers for our
mm-hmm.
community. And they saw us, they believed in us early on, like, long before we were successful and people sort of just jumped on the bandwagon. So when you look back, before you were teaching, before you were
Yeah.
a venture capitalist, who was that foundational sort of neighbor in your early life who kind of gave you that framework to lead the way that you've led.
Yeah. I was, I think I've really been blessed to have a number of people in my life that have been incredibly influential. The first was my great uncle, Zio Antonio. I lived in a row house. Upstairs was Italy and downstairs was America. And my grandmother, grandfather, great aunt, great uncle, two uncles and an aunt lived upstairs, and we lived downstairs. And he was the guy who took me to the library. He would, in the summertime, every single day every day we went to the library. We did those reading programs. He taught me how to read. And I think, that's if you can do anything in your life to help an individual, teach them how to read at any age. Teach people how to read. And your whole world opens up once you know how to read. And you could, just delve into lots of different books. And he was awesome. He was even the guy as I was, becoming a teenager, he'd slip these articles about, sex, from things like the Reader's Digest, to you. And then I think later I was really blessed to have great teachers and sports coaches. One guy in particular, Gene D'Alessandro. Gene D'Alessandro is in the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. He was just an extra. There were several people. I feel bad leaving some out, but they were not just great coaches. They were great teachers, and they were even better people. And the thing I always loved about Gene was he didn't mince words. He was tough. He was very tough. We worked hard with him, and you drilled and you drilled. And I think from him I learned how to work hard. I learned how you don't have to be the most gifted person, and you got to work really hard if you want to win. I know that I was reading something about Michael Jordan once, and he got really mad at a reporter, was interviewing him, and they said, well, you're so gifted. And he goes, I hate it when people say that because it makes it sound like I didn't have to work hard to get where I am. Now, I did not have anywhere near Michael Jordan's skills at anything. But Gene told me to just work it, drill, 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 work really hard, have a good attitude, desire, discipline, dedication, and you'll get somewhere. And I got further along in that sport than I probably would have under anyone else, because he was there, and he was, like I said, he was tough and he was demanding, but he was unbelievably fair. And often had to make really challenging decisions, but never left anybody twisting in the wind. He treated the best wrestler on the team and the worst wrestler on the team, and all the people around that supported it. He treated them alike. There were no surprises with him, and he was an incredible individual.
It's interesting when you talk about that mentorship, because that's a key component too around how you choose to manage the relationships by treating people equally, which means you're treating them with respect.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that he had to make hard decisions. That's another key component for me. When people acknowledge that they have to have a difficult conversation with somebody, and
Yeah.
they think, well, I'm not being kind, or, that's not really the Fred Rogers way. The reality is that when you acknowledge those things, that level of empathy is right out of the Fred Rogers playbook, right?
Yeah.
The idea that when we are empathetic in a variety of different ways, whether it's having a hard conversation or having an easier conversation, it doesn't matter. That's a key component too. Um, I can tell you, you said you didn't want to leave a lot of people out. Uh, I'm sure there is multiple generations of students and business leaders and founders who feel the same way about you, who
That'd be
will look
nice.
back when I ask them, if I ask them that same question in 20 years, your name will come up. And that's why you belong in my neighborhood.
Thanks.
And that's why I'm appreciative of the fact that you chose to come on in spite of our few technical difficulties at the beginning of the podcast that nobody knows about because they weren't part of
too,
it.
two old guys fumbling with the tech. Wow, what a surprise!
And as it turned out, it was my problem, which is the best part of all of it. And that's me being vulnerable, everybody. I screwed up.
It was
Um,
our problem.
but I appreciate you coming on, and I really do appreciate you and want to thank you for joining this growing neighborhood of fantastic leaders who I want to continue to highlight. So thank you, Angelo. It was
It
great
was my
chatting.
pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Take care.
You too. Bye
Bye
now.
bye.